Demitri Downing back at Benzinga, Chicago, Illinois, because I've been around so long, I've dropped the S in honor of Tom, my fellow Illinoisan.
That's right. Illinoisian is actually, it doesn't make any sense.
Are Illinoisans, is that right?
Illinoisian.
Illinoisian.
Perhaps I'm saying it wrong because I just like to say noise. But then, yeah, I'm Tom. Nice to see you guys again.
Cannabis legalization years.
Media Unshackled.
And we are here, and we have special guests from old friends of ours, a company we work with all the time, very well known in the cannabis industry. We got Barrick and Yarrow from Zone Properties. But we're here to have a little kind of special, a special report within the Media Unshackled Benzinga ecosphere. Yeah. Because there's some cool, interesting stuff, not necessarily cool, happening in California that Yarrow is quite a specialist on. So we wanted to get that information out there to the general public. And we've been meaning to do this podcast over the last week or so, and it's great that you're here. This is the great thing about these conferences, is that we can talk about these subjects. So I'm going to get an update while you get an update. But first, give it 30 seconds about you, and then talk about Zone Properties a little bit for like a minute, and then let's get into the SB-51 discussion.
Sure, yeah. My name is Yarrow Kubrin. I'm a second-generation cannabis cultivator. Earned my first dollar in the space at 11, trimming for the mom's family farm in the Emerald Triangle.
Nice.
And I'm a third-generation real estate practitioner. Took 20 units of real estate in college when I was a munchkin and been in real estate for about 20 years. So I focus on cannabis real estate and that overlap. I do focus on policy and I focus on real estate, both of which are incredibly important and super boring. So
Yes.
It's great for you to give us a little bit of a platform to talk about those underpinnings and how they impact the ability for operators to operate, scale, and thrive.
Look, and shout out to Zone Properties. You guys are a leader, not just in doing business in the cannabis space in regards to property. You're also in advocacy. You advocate for the right thing, and I know Bryan for a while, and we've been involved in different projects and stuff, and he's always on top of the right ideas. So, kudos to Zone in general, and it's good to see you on that team.
Thank you. And I've got a great COO next to me. I'd love to hear a little bit about him. That I'm new to the team, right? Not new to the game, but definitely new to the team. And I've had the opportunity to interact with Zone Properties when I was over at Cannabis as a director of real estate, and I was really drawn to the company culture and the way in which they were incredibly professional and responsive. And I think that it's one of the biggest challenges in this industry is that people are so bandwidth constrained that it doesn't matter how talented someone is if you can't reach them. And what I really appreciated about my interactions with Zone before I was a small part of the company was my ability to reach them and to have candid conversations that were very productive that helped me to do business.
I'm picturing Bryan like trying to sleep at night, trying to get on the toilet, but constantly answering his phone right now. Talking about reachable. He's a very reachable dude.
Yeah.
But go ahead, Barrick, talk about you for a second.
Yeah. And thanks, Yarrow, for the kind words. Barrick Blackwell with Zone Properties. Maybe just start with Zone. So Zone Properties been around for about a decade. Cut our teeth originally in the Arizona market, specializing in cannabis real estate, solving the complexity of cannabis property site selection, capital in some ways in terms of being able to bring money to the table, buy properties, lease them to cannabis operators in a sustainable way. We want our operators to be around for 10, 15 plus years, not just a flash in the pan. So we're currently in about 10 states. We've been in Arizona, obviously, for the majority of that. We're still based there, but anywhere there's new licenses being issued or new development happening, we're active. So Illinois, Missouri, New Jersey, New York, Florida, to name a few. And yeah, happy to be here.
The go-to company in this space. Now, this is all great. Now, Tom, this is a very special treat for you.
Why is that?
Okay, because you don't know, we're about to talk about something happening in California, and it's a legal matter, and it's a policy matter, and it's related to social equity.
I love all these things.
These are your topics, and you don't even know this. So Yarrow, you guys feel free to talk about Zone. Google Zone, go-to company. That's a little bit less important right now than the topic that's at hand in California that you've been wanting us to share with the audience. So what's going on?
Sure. So first of all, my comments, statements, and opinions are only mine. Disclaimer. I do not speak for the company. I may have some spicy perspectives, but I am not representing the company in my perspectives. But I do think before I talk about it,
he speaks for me to Unshackle today.
Yeah, I mean, they don't have a mute button for me, and my wife probably wishes they did. But I speak as myself and as somebody who's been deeply involved in social equity policy in California since there was social equity policy in California.
He's getting excited already.
All right.
And But before I head into SB-51, I do think it's important to highlight that, one of the challenges that social equity operators have tends to be access to capital and tends to be cooperative landlords and tends to be the ability to execute sustainable deals, whether those are on startup funds, equity in their business, landlording, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it's really... It is, I know this sounds cheesy, but it's a small honor to be a part of a real estate company that is solving one of those problems for operators, where they don't need to raise as much capital to have to acquire the real estate, and where they can have a landlord that is truly invested in their success beyond 3 or 4 years, and where they can get a team that has so much real estate experience that they're getting 3 units of continuing education credit just by interacting with us and doing business with Zone. That being said, SB-51 was a bill in California put up by Senator Bradford, who's been a huge, staunch ally and advocate to the industry. Recently, I was part of a social equity summit there in Sacramento, and CCIA gave him a kind of a lifetime achievement award. Kind of looked like this little pyramid.
Dark side of the moon pyramid.
Yeah, it was a nice little glass plaque, but the truth is that Bradford has put a lot of work in and has been very consistent in terms of thoughtful ideas around supporting a regulated industry. And so SB-51, there was some pushback from the Department of Cannabis as well as the governor's office. And the pushback was that they wanted to put a cliff in there for social equity permits that were provisional that hadn't transferred to annual. And the idea around that cliff was that at the end of that cliff, they call it a cliff because somebody or something falls off of it, right? And so they were really going to treat these social equity provisional licenses like we were lemmings. And if we didn't make it, we were over the cliff. And so there was some pushback, and Bradford was, lead on this, but there was a lot of coalition support from COA, Social Equity Workers Association of LA, CCIA, the Sonoma County Cannabis Alliance, a variety of brands, even local cities, Oakland, Los Angeles, these local regulatory cannabis programs were in support of this notion that we shouldn't have some sort of cliff for these provisional social equity license holders.
What is that cliff? What does that mean?
So what that means is you start with a provisional license and eventually it transitions over to an annual. And an annual license is far more it's solid. You've gone through all of those processes. And so a lot of people have had to take a long time to transition from a provisional license to an annual license. And the legislation as it had been modified or Frankensteined through the DCC and the governor's office was this idea that if social equity provisional license holders didn't get their transition to an annual within a certain amount of time, they didn't have a license. They were what's called, it's a policy term called SOL. You may have heard of it.
Yeah, it's a short acronym.
Yeah, short acronym. And so what was really great about this exercise was that COA, CCIA, a lot of trade organizations sort of sounded the alarm, and the cavalry came over the hill, and all of a sudden we got a really amazing letter that was drafted, and the number of companies, whether they were advocacy organizations, the Hood Incubator, whether they were brands like Snickerdoodle Dandy, whether they were local regulatory agencies in Los Angeles. There were church organizations that supported this, and this broad coalition of stakeholders said, not on our watch. No, you don't get to move the goalpost on people who put their time, their effort, their resources, their dreams into standing up these businesses and then say, clock ran out on you. And so for me, from a personal perspective, as a verified social equity applicant in San Francisco myself, I have a distribution permit there. And my distribution permit is being incubated by a retailer. So I'm a social equity incubatee. If my incubator doesn't raise the money and build out their location in order to incubate me, and if that doesn't happen quick enough, my distribution license, which is not yet annual at the state level, goes kapoof. And I've been working on this for years. And so that impatience, that inability for them to say, look, these people still deserve to have preferential treatment, especially when there can be economic things beyond their control that could affect their provisional license. It was very challenging. And so the cavalry came over the hill. A lot of people signed this letter. This letter was delivered to, the Department of Cannabis Control as well as the governor's office. And we're basically just advocating for reasonable and sensible business regulations that still prioritize social equity, but don't create this moving of the goalposts.
So the provisional licenses weren't available for non-social equity?
So this was specific to the social equity provisional licenses, correct?
So it was just a concept that they created.
Well, I mean, social equity in terms of permitting has been a concept that was created anyway, right? And the idea is that we're sort of doing a redo on some policies in the past that maybe weren't so fair and equitable, is kind of the kindest way to say it.
Right. Did they have to change? Because like Illinois has a cliff for their craft grows that were all social equity that were issued 2 years ago.
Yeah.
And so their cliff is February 24. And then in the infinite wisdom of the cannabis regulators, they put a 6-month operational deadline into the regulations. So it's like, hey, you win this license, you need to be operational in 6 months. And if you've ever tried to build, because you guys are real estate professionals, if you've ever tried to build a cannabis cultivation facility in 6 months, you're going to build a bad facility. Something's going to go wrong. You can't get it done. It's just infeasible and practical. And then they're all social equity applicants, so they're also raising money. And the actual time for like an average capital raise can be over 2 to 3 years. So if it takes that long to raise that much money and it takes that long to actually build the construction out, why did they make it 6 months to be operational? And that's a deadline that is just looming over the heads of, because they've issued 88 of these licenses. 5 are operational. Another 8 have their blueprints approved and are in construction. So that is quite a failure to launch. And then they might just take away their licenses come February if they aren't operational because they're out of compliance with the rules that the regulators set themselves. So SB-51, did they have similar rules and regulations for the provisionals, like be operational because of this deadline that we randomly selected? And then did SB-51 like change that, or what happened there?
So I want to touch a little bit upon what you said, but I don't want to steal the full microphone here.
We're learning here.
The first is they should have moved that February 24th date to February 29th. Okay, because then at least it would only hit every 5 years, right? I made a calendar joke. I think that's really important to remember. The second thing is, because we are at a capital conference, let's talk about this through the lens of money coming into the industry. If you have a cutoff or a cliff, how am I as an investor going to feel comfortable writing a check on a new business, maybe pre-rev, when there are arbitrary deadlines that are being set by regulators who are not the same stakeholders as those who have capital at risk, and where things go wrong? I mean, 6 months is a change work order in some construction projects, right? Mm-hmm. And so what I know about construction from my experience is nothing ever comes in on time or on budget. And so when they have these cliffs, what it creates is hesitancy in the capital markets to fund these businesses, because those check writers are afraid that there's too many variables that are beyond that entrepreneur's control.
It's also taken the price where they were trading and just collapsed it. Because now, like, nobody wants to buy the cannabis licenses that are expiring in February of next year, but they might buy the ones that are expiring in December of next year. And again, this is just a rule they made up. It's not in the statute. It's just in the regulations. The Department of Agriculture could change the regulation.
Well, that's Illinois.
Right. But so what did SB-51 do? What was the rubric that they had there with their provisional licenses? Did they say get operational in 24 months? Or?
So I believe that a rubric in and of itself means that there's some thinking and some logic, and there's some things that are laid out based on a sort of
rules,
methodical order. And I'm not sure that we have that in what was those proposed modifications to Bradford's bill. What I believe the rumor mill, the sort of word on the street was that they were trying to push back on local regulatory bodies that were slow rolling, transitioning from provisional to annual. And in doing that, the social equity applicants who had a provisional were going to be caught in the crossfire.
Right.
But that the initial intention in tightening up those timeframes was that on a state level, they were very frustrated with their local regulatory bodies.
Yeah. So these are all local social equity licenses that are getting...
Correct.
Okay. I'm just trying to get back. I went to look. This is confusing for me. I went to law school, and I knew he'd pick up. He's got like CPU, like it's incredible over there. So he picks up this stuff much faster than I do. But the audience is somewhere in between you and I. I'm like Tableau.
The audience does not have a law degree. Like, it's less. There's only 1.4 million lawyers, and then so that means it's like 0.6% of the population.
So what's the current status of SB?
So obviously I've been laser focused on getting prepared for this conference and getting here and making sure I brush my teeth before I touch down at O'Hare. The last that I heard, Bradford had pushed back on those proposed modifications from the governor's office and from the Department of Cannabis Control and said, you don't get to gut that. And so where it's at next, I'm not sure. But they had made these proposed modifications, and we had really encouraged him to say that that's gutting the intention of what was trying to be done.
Okay. Yeah, and this is such a complicated, nuanced subject. Everybody out there needs to understand that all these social equity laws, all these social equity policies, programs, regulations are being created uniquely, not just at the different state levels throughout the country. And you have to really, you're an absolute expert on Illinois, you're an absolute expert on California, but then California is creating them at the local level.
Yeah. And I would never say I'm an absolute expert on anything. What I would say is that I'm a stakeholder, both as somebody who serves the industry, helping people to find compliant real estate, as somebody who is personally social equity verified in San Francisco, now soon to be Sonoma County, as well as Maryland, and also as somebody who just kind of wants to see a betterment and a level playing field for those who were previously impacted by failed policies. And so I don't propose that I'm an expert. What I would say is that I'm passionate about making sure that we have opportunity for those who have already gotten through a lot of the process and deserve to not have the rules changed on them midstream. There's a common refrain we hear in this industry about building the airplane as it takes off. Okay. And what I hate about that common refrain is that 100% of the time in that analogy, the airplane crashes. So it's not really a great analogy because I'm not into airplane crashes. It's not my thing. And so I just think that we need to make sure that we acknowledge that when we change policy on entrepreneurs and they are already downstream and they've already put in money and time and resources, what we're doing is really putting yet another nail in the industry's coffin and then wondering why they can't get their act together. And I think that we just need to make sure that regulators and policymakers are very consistent, and that even though we know public policy means making adjustments, that the adjustments that are made to public policy don't penalize the entrepreneurs that are trying to further the regulated industry.
Was this an inadvertent penalization, or was there somebody behind this?
I think it was an inadvertent penalization that was intended to have the local regulators get their act together and put pressure on them from the state level, but that in that these social equity applicants would be harmed.
Right. And so this brings up another question, and I don't mean to take this another direction. What do you think about, you're a California expert. You have social equity at the local level, not the state level. Maryland, Illinois, you have social equity at the state level, not necessarily the local level. I really don't know.
Maryland and Illinois are state licensed, so it's just single license structure. California would have to do it at the local level or at the state level because the state, it's a dual licensing structure in California.
Right. So what do you think about the differences between those two structures? Like in Arizona, let me just give you a quick example. We have the state level social equity, and we have local jurisdictions trying to figure out how to get involved. Right. And Zone has been really on top of that. Kudos to you guys. But what do you think about the difference? Because you're...
Well, I got kind of on the one hand and on the other hand. I'm not in the 0.6% of 1.4 million population that has a law degree, but I think you've got these competing interests. On the one hand, these programs, the idea was that we would give local control so that these programs could have a local flavor. And Compton is not the same as Compshe. And there is a variety of different regions in California. And the idea that these regions could tailor these programs to more represent their constituents on paper makes a lot of sense. What we've seen with local control, though, unfortunately, was that when California was out of the gate, 3/4 of those municipalities or 58 counties were retail deserts because local control, they said, nah, not in our backyard. So there's some problems with local control. The problem that I have with a state level definition is how do you incorporate both an urban and agrarian definition of social equity and make sure that it's broad enough that we're not excluding people, and also making sure that those qualifications have enough diversity within those qualifications to reflect those various markets that we have in California, because California is a big state.
Oh yeah.
And those are good points to reflect on. And really, it's a lot of reflection that needs to be done, because there's no absolute right or wrong about how this is done or how it should be done. I know Tom's over there thinking, I want to give this guy a hug.
Oh, no, it's fantastic.
He loves
I mean, the hugs is a different video we can make later, but
cool.
I'm not sure exactly how I feel about that. I got to sit with that for a second.
But I really appreciate that, they are trying. They get it wrong because they've never made up these regulations before. It's the first time they've ever tried. So whether it's 6 months to be operational after getting a cultivation license in our state, or these cliffs that they've just made up out of whole cloth. Hopefully the regulators listen to the constituents, and especially the stakeholders that have the actual licenses, and make policy and regulations and rules that instead of stymieing or playing gotcha or frustrating the entrepreneurs, allows the entrepreneurs to do their job and of course, like follow the rules in a compliant way, so it's a safe industry, so that when we consume this, it's a consumable product, it's not going to have any problems with it. Yeah. Are they actually trying to do it? I don't know. Like, we were just talking to an operator in Illinois. They have an infuser license, it's called. It's basically our extractor. The regulators show up unannounced every week.
That seems a little intrusive. I mean, the only person who gets to do that in our life is my mom, and she's usually bringing raspberries or something to the kitchen table. Yeah. One of the challenges that we do have in California in terms of that local definition versus state definition is there is state money available for local jurisdictions that bolt on a social equity program, and it's great that there's an incentive for that. The challenge has been that their iterations don't seem to always draw upon the lessons learned in previous policy. I'll give you an example. Sonoma County is standing up a social equity policy. Thank you, Sonoma County. Much love. Their initial draft of those regulations said, well, if you're justice involved, but you have to be justice involved after, say, 1996. Well, and I said, well, what about Brownie Mary? Are you telling me that some of this is an ageist policy? What if you've got some old dinosaur with a bunch of wrinkles who wants to stand up a license? Now you're saying that if they were just as involved too early, that they're somehow penalized? Didn't make a lot of sense. I think they were trying the right thing. The other thing also is in their policy now, their current iteration, you get points for social equity if you went to a foster home. And I understand again the notion that we want to, but I'm not totally sure how that works, right? And there's an A qualification and B qualification. You have to qualify for the A to go down to the B, and then the B you get a bunch of different points. But there were some things that felt a little random from a public policy perspective. So I do think that we want to allow social equity programs to have some nuance and some local flavor, but I also think that some of the times it misses the mark. And I think was it Mendocino or Humboldt that said, well, if you've been a victim of this or a victim of that, but you don't have to have any proof for that. Or if you identify a certain way, but you don't have to have any proof for that. That's not an immutable characteristic. And so I do think there's some challenges with local programs that are more restrictive than a state program. And I like the idea of a state program and having a one-size-fits-all. I'd rather see some people qualify for social equity that are marginal than have people who are marginal not qualify for social equity. And so there's been some robust conversations about what does that look like? Well, you have to be justice involved, or it has to be a direct family member. Right. Well, what happens if you had a stepdad? Now we're penalizing people who did they weren't biologically related.
Yeah.
I commend and applaud your in-depth understanding of the social equity issue, and Tom, I know as well, has in-depth understanding. But understand, this is why I'm drawn closer and closer towards a free market approach to things, because these systems, when there's no agreed definition of what is social equity, it's like the word culture. It means something different to everyone.
Yep.
And then you have a government that tries to get involved in creating policy and law around a word that has no definition. It's never going to make sense. So why bother? You know what I'm saying? And it's an old Adam Smith argument. The greatest way to free an individual is to remove these barriers to entry, so that those who can just do.
Well, I think the counter argument to that, because too much agreement kills a good conversation, is that it's not that we're trying to create barriers to entry. We're trying to create additional support and opportunity for constituents who might not otherwise be able to access those opportunities.
Taxes from cannabis should go to funds that are accessible to individuals that then who can draw from those funds to their social equity related projects. That's just my particular model. This barrier to entry to people even get started is a bad idea. And I think, honestly, there is no right or wrong answer. It's an ongoing debate. The different states are doing different things. But in my limited experience, that's what should be happening. And that's that we're missing in this industry, that concept. Take all the taxes that are being derived from Illinois, California, and Maryland, and direct them either to projects that help with substance abuse or issues that were caused by the drug war in different jurisdictions, or entrepreneurism, or social equity qualified individuals. You see what I'm saying? That's just my little thought.
So I don't want to, I want you to jump in, nudge me if you want to talk.
Yeah.
Okay. Here's my only challenge with that. Fundamentally, I have a distrust of government taxing and then being a good steward of that money and deciding how it's spent.
Not going to disagree with you.
Secondarily, when we start attaching earmarks for all of these programs like drug abuse or battered shelters or kids with cleft palates, all noble causes, what happens is we get stakeholders who are not in favor of tax relief for the industry because they're eating off those taxes, and they're all noble causes, and nobody wants to go against kids with cleft palates.
Right.
But then we don't have a broad coalition for tax reform. And so I feel like if we were going to go more free market, maybe the notion is that social equity applicants and those that qualify get a preferred tax tier so that the government is taking less from them. But across the board, I think that we know that there's way too many taxes, and that is one of the biggest challenges with stabilizing less than nascent markets. And so I'm really a big advocate for the notion that prohibition was a tax, right, and that now maybe there should be a lot less taxes. And for certain in California has not created a welcoming environment for people to come into the regulated fold. And the tax structure is absolutely one of the biggest challenges with that.
You make a very convincing argument. I rescind my support for that idea. I'm back to the free market. No taxes. Treat it like tomatoes. Free the weed. I was wrong. You were right. Let's move on. So, Tom, I knew you would appreciate him. You have a mind for this kind of stuff. Closing thoughts. And
you've earned the hug, by the way.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. I do appreciate
closing
that.
thoughts, and then I want you guys to share with people how they get in touch with you.
Closing thoughts. It is a complex problem that has no clear answers because we haven't done it before.
Good summary.
Oh, be next without Barrick.
No.
He's talked the whole time.
Yeah.
No, I think similarly, it's been a learning experience the last few years with different states rolling out different types of programs, and I appreciate Yarrow's expertise on this subject. He's obviously a passionate advocate for this conversation, and yeah, I think that at the end of the day, more conversations like this, productive conversation around what to do next and maybe things to try are the best way forward. So,
excellent.
I mean, I think my summary would be that as a student of public policy in college, the thing that really stood out for me, aside from the really attractive student next to me, was the idea of unintended consequences with policy.
I like how you think.
And so the challenge that I see is new markets replicating old mistakes and saying proudly and triumphantly, taking a victory lap before they've even rolled out their programs, saying we're going to do it better and different. And they have the opportunity to do it better and different, but only if they do it better and different. And if they're replicating mistakes, then they're not actually iterating, they're just repeating. And so I'm sorry, New York. I'm sorry.
Oh, they suck.
And so I think that, there's this idea that okay, we're building a new industry. And I think that part of the shift in thinking is that we're not building a new industry, we're regulating an existing industry. And so we're coming into something that is pre-existing and figuring out how we create age-restricted and supply chain protected and laboratory tested products that are safe. But we really have to wrap our arms with a regulatory paradigm that brings in what already is existing. And I think that's part of the miss from a public policy perspective, is that we're not starting something new. We're embracing something that's pre-existing, and we're helping it to level up and be a net benefit, both economically and in terms of products that are safe to all constituents, and especially that laboratory testing. I think that's really important. The other thing that I would say is just that as we do this, we have to remember that part of the way in which regulated cannabis was sold on stakeholders was this notion that it was going to be a tax bonanza for a bunch of people. And that was the way that they got buy-in. But the tax bonanza hasn't really supported the regulated industry in taking market share away from the unregulated industry. And so I think we have to revisit whether everybody gets to eat off these cannabis taxes and whether that's a really equitable way to support ushering in regulation for an existing industry.
Well, and how do people get in touch with your company? How do people find you guys?
Yeah, zoneproperties.com is probably the easiest way. You can contact us through there. Both Yarrow and I are on that website, and that's probably the easiest way.
These are fascinating questions. These are topics, policy questions that all intelligent thinking members of the cannabis industry are wrestling with, discussing all the times. Reach out to Zoned. You're going to get talent there. You're going to get talent that can help you achieve your objectives and that are involved in advocacy and making this industry better for everyone, however it turns out. So we really appreciate you guys. We appreciate your company.
Thank you.
Tom, I told you like him, right?
Oh, no, the Zone people are great.
Yeah.
Sure.
This has been another episode of Meat Unshackled.